I'm Elaine Morgan and I'm a writer. The main thing I wanted to do was cut out questions I didn't want to answer. It's not that I've got anything to hide, but I hate being asked questions like, what is your favourite this, that and the other thing? And tell me, what date was that? Because I'm hopeless at dates and I never know. I can't answer that one. But the other motivation was that I chose the kind of questions I keep asking myself, some of them. Well, I'm pushing 90 and I think I've been very, very lucky. I think one of the luckiest things is that I was born at a level where you don't expect too much. I feel sorry for the people that George Bernard Shaw called the downstarts. If they start up the top and they become distressed gentlefolk, and all their lives they feel they've been deprived of things they had. Well, I've had nothing like that because it's been, on the whole, some bumps, but steadily uphill most of the way. So that's something to be thankful for. This is the biggest and toughest question, and it's one I keep asking myself. On the whole, yes. I read a quote the other day about somebody who said, the human race can always be relied upon to do the reasonable thing once they've exhausted all the other possibilities. I think that there is something like that about humans. They tend to go on being stupid, but I do think they're getting more and more reasonable. And people like Dawkins, who wrote The Selfish Gene, if you read his book carefully, he says at one point that we're evolving to the time where our selfish gene will hand over to the intelligent part of us and say, well, you decide, do what you think is best. And also Steve Jones says, we've got to the point where we can tell our genes to go and jump in the lake if we don't like what they're advising us. So I think we're improving that way. I think that generation by generation, more things that used to be tolerated have become intolerable. Like they used to have cannibalism, and they used to have bear baiting, and they used to have public hangings and hang-draw and quarter people. None of that, I think, can happen again. I think a lot of the evil things people do to one another is because they're programmed to be afraid of strangers. And now with the internet and everything, people are getting less strange. We're getting more able to understand one another and be less afraid of one another. So optimist, yes. This is the kind of thing people ask you. If you hadn't been you were a poet monkey or something. There are some things I could never have been an athlete. I could never have been a model. I could never have been a musician, but I'd have had a go at most other things. I never planned to write about evolution. I had 30 years as a television dramatist and a lot of success. But then suddenly that one dried up on me because the styles had changed, a new kind of audience, and the attention span had got shorter. So I found I wasn't no longer fitting the bill. And I didn't then think, oh, well, I must start writing about evolution. I just more or less accidentally got into that. And now I've spent at least as long doing that as I was doing television. I wrote this bestseller, my only bestseller, in 1972. Somebody called it a feminist tirade. I was going on about attitudes to women because they were treating us as a kind of inferior type of man, God-made man, and that was the way people ought to be, but we were a bit wonky and we were regarded as more stupid and more this, that and the other. And it was a great success, and I was taken all around America, twice, coast to coast, on all the television programs. And I remember one of these guys, he'd been talking to me about 5 minutes, and in amazement he said, "You like men, don't you?" I said, "Well, you know, I like human beings, and you're one of those, aren't you?" And so, besides, I brought up 3 children. They were all boys, and I mean, they were lovely. So I cannot say, you know, we are the best sex, but I was attacking, and would still attack, a lot of undesirable sort of thought modes and practices and habits of thinking that are still hanging around, saying not only are you different, but you are inferior. And I'll fight that to the death. Why do you live in Mountain Ash? I keep getting asked this, not in Mountain Ash, but when I'm in London or anywhere. Why do you live out there? I mean, so much interest in going to London. You could go to the opera and the theatre and the exhibitions and all that, and meet such interesting people. Well, I find most people are interesting wherever you live. I like it here. I understand the people here. I'm relaxed here. I think if you decide, I mean, this social mobility, if you decide I'm going to be upwardly mobile and mix with a different lot of people, I think you waste an awful lot of psychic energy trying to translate yourself into something different. It's much more comfortable and easier, I think, to stay where you were born. And I found it a very healthy sort of community to grow up with, because when I was growing up, for one thing, it's classless. When Kingsley Amis came to Wales, he said that's one thing about it, it's classless. We were all on the same boat together, and people helped each other, and they knew that if they were going to make a better world, and this valley was full of people who were determined to make a better world, they knew they'd have to do it themselves. And above all, they had a lot of self-respect. You're as good as anybody else, and don't let anybody tell you any different. So I've been grateful for that and glad to stay in this kind of community. Well, I've been voting Labour now for 70 years, but I think we're in a bit of a mess. I still believe in the same principles and the same aims of greater equality and all that, but something's gone wrong with the economics. We used to think that if we could get capitalism more or less out of the way, everything would come right. But they tried that in Russia, and the Berlin Wall came down, and we have to face it, you cannot do it that way. So then the capitalists thought, right, it's all open for us now, and they began to think, if only we could get rid of the state and have absolute freedom to run the world ourselves, we'd do a better job of it. And now you've had the Wall Street crash, and their system isn't working either. And the other thing that's gone wrong is these psephologists have got voting and opinion polls to a fine art, so they can tell them, if you want to get into power, never mind about your heartlands, go in for the marginals and find a policy that will convert just those few people in the middle. Those are the only ones you're going to worry about. Yeah. I think that's sort of death to democracy. Yeah. But there's something missing in both sides. If I had another 50 years, I'd tell you what it was. I'm asking this question in order not to answer it, because I think it's a very stupid question to ask. If you live your life thinking, if only I hadn't done that, if only that happened then, everything would have been wonderful. James Thurber said, if you live like that, you're living in the pluperfect subjunctive, and you cannot change anything, and it's a bad way to live. You've got to take things the way they are. And the great thing to remember is about all these paths you didn't take. For all you know, they might have led somewhere much worse than the place you're in already. They never think that. They think, oh, if only I hadn't married him or something, everything would have been wonderful. It's quite as likely to have been worse. No, I don't believe in God. I've got nothing against him, I just don't think he's there. Up to a point, I can see what Richard Dawkins is getting on about, because terrible things have been done and are being done in the name of God. Like him, I'm a bit worried about all the schools here being taken over by faith schools, and that's going to mean that you'll have groups of people not only believing in God, but believing in different gods. And look what that did in Northern Ireland. But I'm not militant about it, because although a lot of very bad things have been done in God's name, a lot of good things have been done in God's name too. I have known, both around here in the old days and in Oxford and places, I've known a lot of people who believe in him and have been better for believing him because they believe in a good God and they find comfort in it. I don't really feel I should be trying to stop them believing. I just, for myself, I think it's a mistake. I don't think it's evil, but I think it's a mistake. And the other thing that Dawkins leaves out is that people have done just as horrible things, not in the name of God at all. They can do it in the name of patriotism, or they can do it in the name of a political creed, or they can do it out of simply greed, spreading your empire and turning people into slaves. So that what we have got to do is, whether there's a God or there isn't God, try to work out the way we ought to be behaving. No, not a bit. I can't remember what it was like before I was born, or presumably it was all right. I wasn't there, and after I'm dead, again I won't be there. Nothing to be afraid of. I can see that there are nasty ways of dying. I'm prepared to worry about that, same as anybody else. But and I believe in euthanasia. I would hate to think that I was going to be spending weeks and months stuck full of tubes and having nothing to live for, and knowing I was going to be snuffed out at the end of it. I'm strongly in favour of people having the right to say, well, I've had enough now, that was very nice, but I'd like to go, and to be enabled to do that. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of man to find safeguards to put around that. And in the places where they have allowed it, they haven't had great numbers of people rushing to do it, and they haven't found that it make people worse at all. Apart from that, I've had a very good innings. If I went out tomorrow, I'd have nothing to complain of. Well, I heard a joke the other day too, which said, and I feel it so, if God had wanted us to vote, he'd have given us some decent candidates.